Hello everybody and welcome back to another 2022 Overwatch League roster breakdown video. Today we will be taking a look at the roster for the Paris Eternal. Eternal finished with an 8-8 record in 2021 with a 0 differential. So they were literally as middle of the pack as a team could get. A 500 record with a 500 differential. So very middle of the pack team. Had a pretty good season. They definitely defied expectations. Going into the season, a lot of people thought they would be, worse than the London Spitfire. They ended up being 7 games better than the London Spitfire. So a pretty decent performance in the Paris Eternal, considering where people thought they would be in the 2021 season. And going into 2022, they made a pretty good number of changes. Not a ton. All things considered, but a pretty large number of changes. So as we pull up their roster, you can see it here. Their DPS line, they have Naga and Glister. In the tank line, the support line, they have Khan and Dredro. And in the tank line, they have Dawn and Vestola. So a lot of the same players from last season, very little change, but let's jump in and talk about the players that they have. Starting, of course, with the DPS line. And we're going to start with Naga. Returning player from this team last season. I would say and argue that he is the best player from the 2021 Paris Eternal roster. I thought he was very, very good. His Echo in particular was very, very good. I had a very strong Echo and a pretty strong Pharah as well. Those are the two heroes that really stood out to me the most from Naga. And I think when Echo was meta, it was a very good look from Naga. So very, very happy to see Naga returning. I think he is a very good player, very high-level player. I've always felt like DPS is one of those roles where Western players are quite often of an equal level to the kind of Korean or Chinese players who have especially recently been kind of the more well-known players, especially in other roles. DPS has always felt like a role where Western players were a little bit more equal to their Eastern counterparts, and I think Naga is a great example of that. I think he's a fantastic flex DPS player who really was, in my opinion, the best part of this Eternal roster last season. Obviously, last season he was playing alongside predominantly Onigod, as well as some Suna whenever they kind of needed that Tracer play. And now they've just kind of decided to combine all of that into one player by bringing in Glister. Now, Glister, of course, played for the London Spitfire back in 2020, played with the San Francisco Shock last season, and is now with the Paris Eternal. He's the only Korean player on this roster, which, there is a history of Korean players on the Paris Eternal. We consider 2021, of course, they had Sparkle and XC and Hanbin and No Smite and Fielder. They had a lot of Korean players on the roster back then. So now they're back to a bit of a mixed roster, but predominantly Western, all things considered. And Glister can play those hit scan roles, right? He plays the Cassidy, the Widow, the Ashe, also plays the Tracer. Those are kind of the... I actually think of Glister predominantly as a Tracer. That's the role that I think of him on for the most part. So these two, I think, are a very well-rounded DPS line. I don't know if Paris will make more signings. Obviously, I think 6 is what you are required to have on your roster by the time the season starts. I think it's down from 7 because the roster's size has changed. And Paris seems to be a team that likes to kind of bring in the minimum just because, for whatever reason, they just seem to go with a small roster as much as possible. So I think Naga Glister really, if those are the only 2 DPS players they have, it is a pretty solid roster, and it is a pretty good roster that is pretty well-rounded in that DPS line that gives them basically everything they would need. It will provide them with in really many ways, the players that they have in that DPS line would give them the flexibility they need, right? Glister can play hit scan and can play Tracer at a high level. Naga can play all of the flex DPS heroes at a high level. Where you potentially run into the issue is if you get into a situation where you kind of need like double hit scan, which is the only thing that I would consider adding to this roster if I am Paris, is another hit scan player to fill in case you need that. But as things stand right now, it doesn't seem like that's the route they want to go down. And so Naga and Glister provide enough flexibility where they might just be able to say we're going to run compositions that work for us. They may not be the most ideal compositions at all times, but they're at least compositions that work for us and they fit our playstyle, so we're just going to roll with that with Naga and Glister. Those two very good players. I think you have a very solid DPS core there if that is what you go with. And that is really the only place this roster has any major change, right? Glister is a new player to this roster. Everybody else in this roster is returning from last season, so it'll be interesting to see what this Eternal team is able to do going forward with mostly the same roster from last season, right? So that's where the Paris Eternal are at. Because you look at their support line, they have Khan, they have Dredro. Khan, of course, was the team for all of 2021. Dredro joined the team later in the season when Neptuno decided to resign or take a step back, retire, whatever you want to say. And I think Khan and Dredro are both very impressive players. I think Dredro was made this team better. I thought he was a better performer. I think he played better. He looked to synergize better with the team. Neptuno, older veteran guy, just sometimes you just kind of over time end up at a point where you're not as good. Younger players start to overtake you, and Neptuno kind of realized that about himself, which I respect. But Khan and Dredro were a very good support line last year. Khan, obviously, a really good fragging flex support player. His Batiste, his Ana, his Zen, very, very good. We've seen a bit of a movement towards double flex support. This team has opted to go for just one flex support, one main support. I think if you're going to go with two supports, that's what you have to do. You just kind of have to bank on what you can. I think a Brig is going to get a lot of play based on what we've seen from the end of 2021. Going into 2022, I think we're going to see a lot of that same type of stuff. So Dredro can play Brig. That's really all you need out of him, I think, right now is can he play Brig? Can he play Lucio? Can he play Mercy? If you can play those three, you're pretty good. You're doing a pretty good job, and he has those three in his pocket. Khan will be the guy that plays the flex supports. You can teach Dredro to play BAP. If you need like BAP Zen, you can teach Dredro that one, and I think it'll be fine. So I think, like I said, I'm a big fan of if you have the means to have those extra players. You can have that second flex support. You can have that second hit scan player. I will always say that you should, because even if you don't play them all the time, you at least have that safety blanket, which I think is important. But this team has opted just for the double supports, one flex support, one main support. And, I think it's good enough as it is. I think that these two players have proven themselves. They work well together. We saw this team find some success last season, so I think it's very likely that this is going to be a pretty solid support line as we saw last season. And then finally, we have the tank line. We have Dawn and we have Vestola. Vestola, of course, was on this team, got released from the team, and then got brought back. My guess is that they were trying to bring in Poco. That was kind of their push. They were making a push for Poco, and then Poco went to London. And after he left, they said, okay, well, then Vestola's our next guy. We think Vestola's better than the rest. And I think that's to me, that's a sign of good things, right? Some people may disagree with me on this. Some people may say Paris should have just been loyal to Vestola from the beginning. They should have gone with Vestola. But to me, that shows that Avala truly understands the talent in Europe and looked and saw Poco was available and wanted to make a push for Poco. Was saying, look, this is the Paris team. You're a French player. We want to bring you in. We think you are the best European off-tank in the league. And we think that this is where you should come. You should come to our roster. You should come be a part of the Paris Eternal. He ultimately went with the London Spitfire. And then they said, okay, Vestola, you're a guy again. We think you are the next best option. And people may think that that's disrespectful to Vestola. I don't think it is. I think that you have to understand that Poco, we've seen how good Poco is, right? Poco is he's been in a grand finals. He's been in the playoffs. He's been in big moments. He's been on teams that have made it really far. And he's been on some very successful teams. So I don't think it's a ridiculous to think that it's a smart move to go for Poco. That doesn't necessarily mean Vestola's bad, right? If Estola's the second best off tank in Europe, and you have the opportunity to try to get the best off tank in Europe, would you not? Why wouldn't you take it, right? So that's my thought on the matter. I think Vestola's very good. I thought he looked really good for this team when he played for them last season. I think he came in and was a huge part of why the Paris Eternal were so successful last season. Obviously, we're moving into a world of 5v5, so we're going to be seeing a very different look out of the game. I expect Don to play the majority of the time because I still think Reinhardt, Winston, Wrecking Ball, those are going to be the heroes that we see a lot of. Orisa. I don't think we're going to see a ton of Sigma or D.Va solo tanking. I don't think we're going to see a lot of Zarya solo tanking. So I still think that, especially early in the game, teams are going to opt more, especially since we are seeing that teams haven't really been able to practice yet, haven't really gotten to play yet. I think more teams are going to opt to go with the main tank heroes as opposed to the off-tank heroes, because I think that most of those main tank heroes and main tank players a lot of the time, have kind of dictated tempo and playstyle, and off-tanks have been more supportive of their team. Obviously, that's not always the case, but with a lot of teams, that is the way it's been. So I expect those to be the heroes that we see a lot of early on, and because I think that the main tank role has been so instrumental and been such a dictating part of team successes so far in the Overwatch League, that I just think that main tanks are going to be where a lot of the teams tend to favor. And Don was very good for this team last season. Don is still a very good player, a very good main tank, and I think that this tank line is solid, right? They're not going to play with each other anymore. They're going to be separate. One will play or the other will play, and we'll have to see kind of where the meta sets. My prediction is we're going to see more Don than Vestola, and I think that's perfectly fine. I think Don is the better of the two tanks on this team. Once again, not a shot at Vestola. I just think Don has done more for this team. Obviously, he was with the team longer. But I also just think that his heroes are going to be more important when the game opens up to 5v5, and that's what we're going to see. So that's just my thought process. I am sure there are people who will disagree with me. It's going to be different for teams, I think. I think some teams will opt to go for their off-tank player more because their off-tank player maybe is more well-rounded, or is just, someone like the Fusion, who their off-tank player is Fury. They don't have a main tank yet. So I think it's pretty likely that they're going to run Fury more often because that's who they believe in the most. And whoever they get as main tank is just going to be secondary to Fury, right? I think this is a team that's going to go main tank primarily. That is where I think that Don's signing, to me what Don's signing, or return to the team, and the Vestola signing points towards Don being the main guy. So like I said, this roster has not changed much. This roster was 8-8 last season, and so they made one change by having Glister instead of having Onigod and Suna. So I don't really think this roster's expectation is going to be that much higher than it was last season. In fact, I actually think it's more likely this team is not as good this season as it was last season. I would say, by and large, teams that make fewer changes between seasons typically don't have as good of a second season. That's not always the case. Shanghai went from being one of the best teams in the league and finishing third in the playoffs in 2020, to being definitively the best team in the league and winning the league in 2021, right? And they only really made one change, but it was a huge change that I think made the team more well-rounded than they were previously. And that is where I think we are at with this Paris Eternal team, where they did make one change that could be that change that really pushed them over the edge, but so many other teams have made changes. And when you're talking about a Paris team that wasn't at the top, they were in the middle. I think so many teams that were worse than them, arguably worse than them, like a team like New York, which made a lot of changes. I think it makes their roster look a lot better. I think they will be, they'll be in the same region as the Paris Eternal, and I don't think New York is looking like a worse team than the Paris Eternal is. I think they're looking better. You have a team like Boston that's made some pretty major changes. I think they are potentially looking better than the Paris Eternal. The London Spitfire and the Vancouver Titans, who were not good teams last season, have made pretty major moves, and they potentially are looking better than the Paris Eternal. So I think Paris, in a way, I respect the fact that they felt like their roster last season was good and it overplayed expectations. But I still feel like Overwatch is in this really bizarre place, and the Overwatch is in this bizarre place where I get going to Overwatch 2, you don't know what to expect, and so making huge changes to your roster just doesn't seem like a good move, because maybe you make a bunch of changes and your new players are not as good as your old players were, and you just instead ride with the players that have pre-built synergy, which I think is important going to Overwatch 2. It's a game that's changing. It's a game that is going to be different. And I think the teams that are going to, early on especially, find the most success are those teams that have those pre-existing synergies. Teams that haven't made a lot of changes. It's why I think teams like New York might struggle early on, or teams like Vancouver and London might struggle early on, because they're kind of new pieces being put together. Whereas teams like Paris or Dallas or Shanghai or the Gladiators, which are largely still the same team from last season, with just maybe one or two new pieces in there, will find the most success because they already know, okay, here's what this player does well, here's what this player doesn't do well, so we know how to accommodate for those strengths and weaknesses, and what we need to do. That isn't what you're seeing with some of these other teams. So that is where I do think Paris has the possibility of finding a lot of success early on, because they're a team that knows their teammates well, because they've been together for a long time. The other major change of this Paris Eternal team, of course, is their coaching. Previously, they had Get Amazed, who I thought did a great job with this team, considering they overplayed expectations. J-Mac was an assistant coach for this team last season, and he is going to be their head coach for 2022. They also have a new assistant coach, Mobugi, who is another Korean coach. So, Korean coaching staff. Obviously, Avala is South Korean, but from Australia, so she's helping this team as well. She's done a very good job with this team as the general manager. So I do really like what this team has done. I like a lot of what they've put together. I think it's a very good-looking team based on what we saw from them last season. Like I said, I do have my concerns about how well they'll be able to kind of do similar things that they did last season. I think that a lot of what we have seen from the teams this season is that they have improved their rosters. And there's obviously been that huge talking point that the Paris Eternal won half of their games by playing against Vancouver and London last season. So, outside of those wins, they were a 4-8 team. But you win the games you win, and they still had big wins. Obviously, there was that win against the Gladiators that a lot of people talked about for a long time. So this is a team that's interesting to me because they have not changed a lot, and I think that they're going to be one of those teams that their success is going to be very easy to tell from very early on because of how connected their roster is. If they get off to a good start, I think they're a good team that we're going to look at potentially in a similar spot where they were last season, where they might not be a top-level team, but they're in the middle of the pack. They get those wins against some good teams just because of meta changes or because of just their synergy early on is just a little bit better, and they're a little more coordinated in the beginning of the season than their opponents are. And that's where I think it's going to be interesting to see. I don't remember who they open up against to start the season. I know everybody's playing the first weekend, so I will pull it up and just look at it. But I think it's interesting to kind of look at where these teams are and who they have to play, and what kind of things we see from them early on. Their opening game, they actually play the San Francisco Shock, which is a tough one to open up against, and then they play the Florida Mayhem, which I think the Florida Mayhem game is definitely winnable. The Shock game is another one of those games which I think could be, for the same reason I said before, could be a bit of a quiet upset because the Eternal are a team that are more synergized. They've played with each other for a long time. They know their players. They know their teammates. They know what they can do. And so I think there is a bit of a potential for that. So definitely a team to look out for to potentially have a big upset potential throughout a lot of the season. But I still think they're going to be a pretty middle-of-the-pack underdog team for most of the season. But that's my thoughts really on this Paris roster. Very interested to hear what other people think about this roster. Let me know your thoughts on this team in the comments down below. A fascinating roster to me, fascinating team. One of my favorite teams to watch last season. The way they played was really exciting, so I'm excited to see them again in Overwatch 2. That's going to be all for me for today. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing for more videos like this in the future. That's going to be all from me. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, Bye bye.